He constantly mocked me. If it weren't for you, Mom would have had a normal family. Until he found himself homeless, abandoned, and called me, begging for help. Growing up, I always knew I was the disappointment. My brother was everything parents dream of having: tall, athletic, charming, the kind of kid who made straight A's without trying and had colleges calling him before he even graduated high school. Me? I was just there. The extra kid who somehow made the family photos look unbalanced. The weight started piling on when I was around 12. Maybe it was stress, maybe it was genetics, maybe it was the way I'd sneak food into my room after dinner because eating downstairs meant listening to comments about portion sizes and how I should try the salad instead. My brother never missed an opportunity to point out how I looked compared to him. He'd walk around the house shirtless after his workouts, flexing in mirrors, while I wore oversized hoodies even in summer. Family dinners were the worst. My parents would praise everything he did: his latest game stats, his scholarship opportunities, how popular he was at school. When they turned to me, it was always with this forced enthusiasm, like they were trying to find something, anything, to be proud of. My brother would smirk across the table, and I knew exactly what he was thinking. Sometimes he'd say it out loud when our parents weren't listening. How much easier everything would be if it was just him. How I was holding the whole family back. How embarrassing it was to have me as a brother. The comments about my appearance were constant. He'd grab the fat around my stomach when no one was looking, pinch it, and whisper about how disgusting I was. He'd make pig noises when I walked by his room. When his friends came over, he'd introduce me as his little brother even though I was only 2 years younger. But the emphasis was always on little, like I was small and insignificant, not younger. High school was brutal. I tried to keep my head down, focus on my grades, maybe find some friends in the computer lab or library. But my brother was everywhere. Captain of 3 different teams, student government, homecoming court, you name it. And everywhere he went, the story followed. The golden boy with the loser brother. I'd hear kids talking about it in the hallways. How weird it was that 2 people from the same family could be so different. The worst part wasn't even the bullying at school. It was coming home and realizing my own family saw me the same way. My parents never said it directly, but their disappointment was obvious. They'd talk about my brother's future like it was already written in stone: college scholarships, professional success, the perfect family he'd have someday. When they talked about my future, if they talked about it at all, it was always with this cautious optimism, like they were hoping I'd figure something out eventually, but weren't holding their breath. I remember one particular dinner when I was 16. My brother had just gotten accepted to his dream school with a full athletic scholarship. The whole meal was about him, his achievements, his plans, how proud everyone was. When I mentioned that I'd been accepted into the honor society at school, the response was lukewarm at best. My brother just laughed and said something about how being smart wouldn't matter if I couldn't fit through doorways. My parents didn't say anything, but they didn't defend me either. That night, lying in bed, I made a promise to myself. I was going to get out. Not just out of the house, not just out of town, but out of this entire dynamic where I was always the afterthought, always the disappointment, always the fat burden taking up space in someone else's perfect family. College was my escape route, but it wasn't easy. My grades were good enough to get me into a decent state school, but there was no athletic scholarship waiting for me, no full ride. I took out loans, worked part-time jobs, did whatever it took to pay my own way. My parents helped with some expenses, but it was always with this reluctant attitude, like they were throwing good money after bad. My brother, meanwhile, was living it up at his fancy private university. Everything paid for, everything handed to him, surrounded by people who worshipped the ground he walked on. He'd come home for holidays with stories about his amazing life, his teammates, his girlfriend, all the opportunities opening up for him. I'd sit there listening, working on homework for classes I was paying for myself, wondering what it would feel like to have life be that easy. Update 1. The first real crack in my brother's perfect facade happened during his junior year of college. He'd been dating this girl for about 2 years, someone from a wealthy family, exactly the type of person my parents hoped he'd end up with. They talked about her like she was already family, always asking about her, including her in holiday plans, basically treating her better than they'd ever treated me. But something was off. My brother started coming home more often, and when he did, he wasn't his usual cocky self. He was drinking more, staying out late, getting into arguments with our parents about stupid stuff. I was living in a tiny apartment near my college by then, but I'd still come home for family dinners sometimes, mostly because my mom would guilt-trip me if I didn't. One of those dinners, my brother showed up clearly hungover. He was picking at his food, barely participating in conversation, and when my dad asked him about his girlfriend, he just shrugged and said they were taking a break. My parents immediately went into crisis mode, asking what happened, whether they could help fix things, if there was anything they should know. That's when my brother looked across the table at me with this expression I'd never seen before. Not his usual smugness or contempt, but something almost like envy. He said something that stuck with me. How lucky I was that nobody expected anything from me. How easy it must be to live without pressure, without everyone watching and waiting for me to succeed. I was so shocked I didn't even know how to respond. Here was the golden child, the one who'd had everything handed to him his entire life, telling me I was the lucky one. It was like looking at a completely different person. A few weeks later, I found out what was really going on. My brother had been struggling academically, not failing, but not excelling the way everyone expected. His athletic performance was declining too. He'd started partying more, missing practices, getting into trouble with his coaches. The girlfriend hadn't just taken a break from him. She'd found out he'd been cheating on her with multiple people and had completely cut him off. But the real kicker was what my parents did when they found out. Instead of acknowledging that their perfect son had screwed up, they started making excuses. The stress of college athletics, the pressure to perform, how difficult it must be to maintain such high standards. They never once suggested that maybe he needed to face consequences for his actions or take responsibility for his choices. Meanwhile, when I'd struggled with anything, grades, social situations, my weight, whatever, the message had always been that I needed to try harder, do better, figure it out on my own. The double standard was so obvious it was almost laughable, except it wasn't funny at all. My brother managed to graduate, but barely. No professional athletic career, no prestigious job offers, nothing like what everyone had expected. He moved back home temporarily, which turned into permanently, while he figured things out. My parents continued making excuses, continued treating him like their precious baby who just needed time and support. I, on the other hand, had graduated with honors, found a decent entry-level position, and was slowly building an actual life for myself. Not glamorous, not impressive by anyone's standards, but mine. I was learning to cook for myself, making a few friends, even dating occasionally. For the first time in my life, I felt like I wasn't just surviving, I was actually living. Update 2. By the time I turned 25, I'd moved to a different city about 3 hours away from my hometown. Not far enough to completely cut ties, but far enough to have my own space, my own routine, my own identity separate from being the disappointing younger brother. I'd lost some weight, not dramatically, but enough to feel better about myself. More importantly, I'd gained confidence. I had a job I didn't hate, a small circle of friends who actually seemed to enjoy my company, and for the first time in years, I wasn't constantly thinking about how I measured up to my brother. My brother, meanwhile, was still living at home at 27. He'd bounced between a few different jobs, nothing sticking, nothing that matched the grandiose future everyone had imagined for him. My parents were still supporting him financially, still making excuses, still treating him like he was going through a temporary rough patch rather than acknowledging that maybe their golden child wasn't so golden after all. The few times I came home to visit, the dynamic was awkward. My brother seemed almost resentful of my independence, like he couldn't understand how I'd managed to build a life for myself when he was struggling to figure out what he wanted to do with his. My parents were still focused on him, still worried about his future, but there was an underlying tension now, like they were starting to realize that their investment might not pay off the way they'd hoped. I remember one particular visit where my brother made some comment about how easy I had it, living alone without any responsibilities. I almost laughed out loud. Easy. I was working 40+ hours a week, paying all my own bills, dealing with adult life completely on my own while he was still having his laundry done and his meals cooked for him. But I didn't say anything. I'd learned that defending myself in that house was pointless. Then came the phone call that changed everything. It was a Tuesday night in March. I'd just gotten home from work, was heating up some leftover takeout, planning to watch something mindless on TV and go to bed early. My phone rang, and I saw my brother's name on the caller ID. We hadn't spoken directly in months. All communication went through our parents. so I was immediately suspicious. When I answered, I could barely understand him at first. He was crying, slurring his words, clearly drunk out of his mind. Between the sobs and the rambling, I eventually pieced together what had happened. He'd gotten married about 6 months earlier, something I'd found out about secondhand because apparently I wasn't important enough to be invited to the wedding. It had been a quick courthouse thing with some girl he'd been dating for a few months. Now she'd kicked him out. Not just asked him to leave, but literally packed his stuff in garbage bags and left it on the front porch while changing the locks. He'd been staying in his car for 3 days, had spent what little money he had on alcohol, and was calling me from a gas station parking lot because he had nowhere else to go. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to hang up. This was the same person who'd spent years making my life miserable, who'd never shown me an ounce of respect or kindness, who'd made it clear that he considered me worthless. Why should I care that he'd finally hit rock bottom? But there was something in his voice, not just the desperation, but a kind of brokenness I'd never heard before. He wasn't calling me because he wanted to. He was calling me because he was out of options. Our parents had apparently refused to let him move back home this time, telling him he needed to figure his life out on his own. His few remaining friends had gotten tired of his drinking and drama. I was literally his last resort. I told him to stay where he was and drove 3 hours through the night to pick him up. When I found him, he was passed out in the driver's seat of his car, which was parked crooked across 2 spaces behind a 24-hour diner. He looked terrible, unshaven, clothes wrinkled and stained, smelling like he hadn't showered in days. This was the same person who used to spend hours in front of the mirror, who'd always been so concerned with his appearance, who'd mocked me for not caring enough about how I looked. I woke him up and helped him into my car. He was still drunk, but coherent enough to mumble some kind of thank you. The drive back to my place was mostly silent. A few times he started to say something, but then stopped himself. I could feel him looking at me, probably trying to figure out why I'd come, but I wasn't ready to have that conversation yet. Update 3. I let my brother crash on my couch for what was supposed to be just a few days while he figured out his next move. Those few days turned into weeks, and those weeks started stretching toward months. It wasn't easy. My apartment was small, barely big enough for one person, let alone 2. My routine was completely disrupted. Worst of all, having him there brought back all those old feelings of inadequacy and resentment that I'd worked so hard to overcome. But something strange started happening. Without our parents around to enable him, without his usual safety nets, my brother began to change. Not dramatically at first, and not consistently, but enough that I started seeing glimpses of a person I'd never known existed. He started doing small things around the apartment, washing dishes, taking out trash, picking up groceries. Not because I asked him to, but because he seemed to recognize that he was imposing on my space and my life. He stopped drinking entirely after the first week, partly because I didn't keep alcohol in the house, and partly because he seemed genuinely ashamed of the state I'd found him in. The biggest surprise was that he started talking to me. Not the casual small talk we'd exchanged at family gatherings, but actual conversations about real things. He told me about his marriage, how he'd rushed into it because he thought it would make him feel more adult, more successful, more like the person everyone expected him to be. He talked about the pressure he'd felt his entire life to be perfect, to live up to expectations that kept getting higher no matter what he achieved. I found myself feeling something I'd never experienced before, sympathy for my brother. Not forgiveness, that would take much longer, but a kind of understanding. He'd been trapped in his own version of our family dynamic, just from the other side. While I'd been struggling with being the disappointment, he'd been struggling with being the golden child who could never afford to show weakness or failure. One evening, about 6 weeks after I'd picked him up from that gas station, we were sitting in my small living room after dinner. He'd been quieter than usual all day, and I could tell something was bothering him. Finally, he looked at me and said something that I'll never forget. He told me he'd been thinking about our childhood, about all the things he'd said and done to me over the years. He said he'd never really understood why he'd been so cruel, but now he thought maybe it was because he'd been jealous. Not of my life. He was clear about that, but of my freedom to fail, to be imperfect, to not have everyone's expectations weighing on him constantly. He said watching me build a life for myself, seeing me independent and self-sufficient while he was falling apart, had made him realize how wrong he'd been about everything. He'd spent so long thinking of me as the family failure that he'd never noticed I was actually the one who'd figured out how to succeed on my own terms. I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to tell him he was right to feel guilty, that he'd made my childhood hell and deserved whatever consequences he was facing now. But another part of me recognized that he was genuinely trying to understand and make amends for something he'd never even acknowledged before. We talked until almost 3 a.m. that night. He told me about the pressure he'd felt to maintain his image, how exhausting it had been to always be on, always performing for everyone around him. I told him about the loneliness of being the afterthought, the frustration of never being seen as valuable or worthwhile by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. It wasn't a magical moment of forgiveness and reconciliation. Too much had happened for that. But it was the first time in our lives that we'd seen each other as actual people rather than just roles in our family drama. The turning point came when my brother started talking about wanting to get help. Not just for the drinking, but for everything. The depression he'd been hiding, the anxiety about never living up to expectations, the way he'd used alcohol and relationships to avoid dealing with his problems. He'd been researching treatment options online, but everything he found was expensive, and he had no insurance, no savings, no way to pay for the kind of intensive program he thought he needed. I made a decision that surprised even me. I offered to help him pay for treatment. Not because I owed him anything, not because I'd forgiven him for everything he'd put me through, but because I could see he was genuinely trying to change, and I had the means to help. I'd been saving money for years, partly because I'd always been careful with finances, partly because I didn't have much of a social life to spend money on. I had enough to cover a month-long residential program about 2 hours away, plus some additional outpatient support afterward. My brother cried when I told him. Not the desperate, drunken crying from that phone call, but genuine tears of gratitude and disbelief. He asked me why I was willing to do this for him after everything he'd done to me. I told him it wasn't really for him, it was for me. I needed to know I'd done everything I could to help, not because he deserved it, but because that's who I wanted to be. Final update. Taking my brother to the treatment facility was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. Not because I was sad to see him go, but because it forced me to confront feelings I'd been avoiding for months. As I watched him walk through those doors, carrying a small bag with basically everything he owned in the world, I realized I was scared. Not scared for him, but scared of what would happen to me. For the first time in my adult life, I'd been needed by someone in my family. Not just tolerated or pitied, but actually needed. My brother had depended on me, had looked to me for help and support, had seen me as someone worth talking to and confiding in. As messed up as the situation had been, it had also been the closest thing to a real relationship I'd ever had with anyone in my family. Now he was going away to get better, and I didn't know what that would mean for us. Would he go back to being the person who'd made my life hell for so many years? Would our parents welcome him back with open arms and forget this whole episode ever happened? Would I go back to being the disappointing younger brother who existed on the margins of the family? The first few weeks were the hardest. My apartment felt too quiet, too empty. I'd gotten used to having someone else around, to making dinner for two, to having someone to watch TV with in the evenings. I'd forgotten how lonely my life had been before my brother showed up, and now that loneliness felt even more intense. But slowly, I started to rebuild my routine. I reconnected with friends I'd been neglecting while dealing with my brother's crisis. I started exercising more regularly, not to lose weight, but because it made me feel better mentally. I even went on a few dates, something I'd barely attempted in years. My brother called me once a week from the facility. The conversations were awkward at first. We didn't really know how to talk to each other without the crisis situation that had brought us together. But gradually, we found our rhythm. He told me about his therapy sessions, about the things he was learning about himself and his relationships. I told him about my job, my friends, the small details of my daily life that I'd never shared with anyone in my family before. One conversation stands out in particular. He'd been in treatment for about 3 weeks, and he sounded different, clearer, more thoughtful. He told me he'd been talking to his therapist about our family dynamics, about the roles we'd both been forced into as kids. He said he was starting to understand how much damage had been done to both of us, just in different ways. Then he said something that caught me completely off guard. He told me he was proud of me, not for helping him, though he was grateful for that, but for the life I'd built for myself. He said he'd been watching me during those months he'd stayed at my place, seeing how I handled work stress, how I managed my finances, how I maintained friendships, and he'd realized I was actually the successful one in the family. Success, he said, wasn't about being the golden child or meeting everyone else's expectations. It was about being able to take care of yourself, to build relationships based on who you really are rather than who you're pretending to be, to find contentment in your own life rather than constantly performing for other people's approval. I cried after that phone call. Not sad tears, but something else. Relief, maybe, or recognition. For the first time in my life, someone in my family had seen me clearly and valued what they saw. When my brother completed the program, he didn't come back to stay with me. He'd found a sober living facility in another city, got connected with a job placement program, started building his own independent life from scratch. We still talked regularly, but now it was because we wanted to, not because either of us needed something from the other. Our relationship with our parents remained complicated. They were happy he was sober and getting his life together, but they seemed to have trouble accepting that he'd fundamentally changed. They kept waiting for him to move back home, to slip back into his old role as the family favorite. When he didn't, when he maintained boundaries and insisted on handling his own problems, they seemed almost disappointed. As for me, I stopped going home for every holiday, stopped feeling obligated to maintain relationships that had never been healthy or supportive. I started spending holidays with friends, or sometimes just by myself, and discovered that I actually enjoyed my own company when I wasn't constantly measuring myself against someone else's expectations. The last time I saw my brother was about 6 months after he'd left treatment. He was doing well, working a job he didn't love but that paid the bills, living in a small apartment, going to meetings regularly. He looked healthier than I'd seen him in years, but more than that, he looked at peace with himself. We had dinner at a small restaurant near his place. Nothing fancy, just burgers and conversation. He thanked me again for everything I'd done, but I could tell he'd moved past feeling like he owed me something. We were just two brothers having dinner, talking about our lives, enjoying each other's company. At the end of the meal, he said something that I think about often. He told me he'd finally figured out what our childhood had been missing. Our parents had been so focused on success and failure, on who was the golden child and who was the disappointment, that they'd forgotten to teach us how to just be brothers. He was right. We'd spent so many years on opposite sides of our family's dysfunction that we'd never had the chance to simply care about each other as people. But now, as adults who'd both survived our upbringing in different ways, we were finally learning what that felt like. I don't know if our story has a happy ending in the traditional sense. We're not a close family now, probably never will be. Too much happened, too many years of damage to undo completely. But we're something better than we were before. We're honest with each other, we support each other when it matters, and we've both learned to build lives that make sense for who we actually are rather than who we were supposed to be. Sometimes people ask me why I helped my brother when he'd been so cruel to me for so many years. The answer isn't simple, and it's not really about forgiveness or family obligation or any of the easy explanations people want to hear. I helped him because I'd spent my entire life feeling worthless in my family, and when he called me that night, desperate and broken, I realized I had something valuable to offer. Not money, not connections, not any of the things that had always seemed to matter to everyone else, but something more basic, the ability to show up for another person when they needed it most. In saving my brother, I discovered I'd been strong all along. I just hadn't realized it because strength in my family had always been defined as being perfect, being successful, being everything my brother appeared to be. But real strength, I learned, is surviving imperfection, building a life despite disappointment, and still being willing to help someone else even when they don't deserve it. My brother called me a fat burden for most of our lives. In the end, I was the one who pulled him out of the gutter. Not because I owed him anything, not because I'd forgiven him for everything, but because that's who I chose to be. And that choice, more than anything else, proved to me that I'd never been the disappointment after all.